G'day brewers. In all my years of brewing, one of the styles I've never truly mastered is the American Pale Ale, even though it's the style that got me into craft brewing in the beginning. So in this video, I want to try and create a recipe from the ground up and brew that beer to see if we can create an award-winning American Pale Ale. To do that, I'm going to get some advice from some experts on YouTube, and then we'll go through the recipe creation from the ground up and then brew it and taste the beer to see how we went. Stay tuned. To help get started with my recipe design, I'm going to get some help from Hendo from Rockstar Brewing. If you're not already subscribed to his YouTube channel and podcast, do that. It's an amazing source of information for brewers.
So let's talk about the makeup of a good West Coast Pale Ale or IPA. So the first thing you need to consider is your malt base. Malt base for a good West Coast style beer needs to be lean and simple. And so what's worked for me is basically using Pilsner malt or even your domestic two-row or domestic Pilsner malt as your base. Then what I'll do is I'll add in a little bit of Munich or Vienna malt just to add in a little bit of bready sweetness, and then optionally I may add in some crystal malt. Now let's talk about crystal malt for a second. Now I tend to not use crystal malt in modern pale ales anymore, and the reason is that crystal malt tends to oxidize quite quickly because of the Maillard compounds in it.
Okay, so let's have a look at the beer that kicked this style into gear, the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. This is the Hoppy Days version, their attempt to clone this recipe. And you'll notice we've got 4.8 kilograms of Voyager Compass malt, which is a pale ale, not a big forward, but more of an American style, more restrained pale ale. 300 grams of medium crystal malt. Now we're not going to include that in our recipe because, as Hendo says, that tends to give emphasis to the oxidation of the beer. So we're going to get rid of that. But this is a major component of Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, the original Pale Ale, although modern Pale Ales tend to drop this out. And sour grapes is for bringing the pH of the mash down so that it hits that target pH 5.2 to 5.6. Cascade is an important hop in Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, and the Hoppy Days version adds 50 grams of cryo as a dry hop to really bump up that Cascade character. And then it's fermented with a classic West Coast Pale Ale yeast. So that's the classic American Pale Ale recipe, but it's not necessarily what will win a comp in our modern climate. Modern American Pale Ales are lighter in color. They don't often add crystal malt because they really want to emphasize the nature of the hops involved. And of course, they're going to use a lot more New World hops, the Citras, Mosaics, Eldorados, those sort of things. Let's turn now to another YouTube channel, Mean Brews. If you're not already, you should be subscribed to Mean Brews. He's got this approach where he breaks down all the data from different competitions to see what an award-winning recipe looks like. And this is his video on the American Pale Ale. So let's have a little look at what we can learn about malt bill, about the hops involved, the process, and the yeast involved from these award-winning beers.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Mean Brews. Today we're covering American Pale Ale, very close to the IPA. Let's get right into the data. I have 80 American Pale Ale recipes, 8 of which were best of show, 38 gold, 10 silver, 6 bronze, and 18 were award-winning. This was a lot of data to compile, 80 different recipes, my largest data set so far. The BJCP style is 18B, a pale, refreshing, and hoppy ale, yet with sufficient supporting malt to make the beer balanced and drinkable. This was very close to the IPA on the evolution of the style and the variability between the recipes.
Yeah, it's a good point. These beers are getting more hoppy, less dark. They're getting paler over time and more bitter. So let's see where we end up.
When we look at the original gravity, we had anywhere between 1.040 and 1.072 with an average of 1.055. A little bit on the high side and a lot outside of the range that BJCP specifies. My recipe is going to be a little bit high, 1.057, and the reason...
So we won't. What we're going to shoot for is that 10.055 or maybe slightly lower. Hopefully land us somewhere about around an ABV of 5 or 5.5.
is we're seeing a trend over time for the gravity of this style to increase. Pretty clear trend here. Pearson's correlation coefficient of 0.33. So I'm shooting for 1.057 for my recipe. For the IBUs, we had anything from 9 to 130. I think that's in the IPA range. Most of the data is outside of the BJCP range. What I think you'll see when I get to the data is this style's really merged with IPA. IBUs may be a bit low, but from hoppiness, it's on the same, or hop flavor and hop aroma, it's on the same scale as IPA. Mean was 45, which was on the high side again, and I plan to be right there, 45 IBUs, calculated IBUs.
Yeah, we're not going to go that high. We might shoot for about 35 IBUs. I think that's a good sweet spot for an American pale ale. But we'll also adjust our water chemistry so we emphasize that bitterness and dryness in the finished beer.
SRM, anywhere between around 3.8 and 11. Pretty much stayed within the BJCP range. The mean was 6.5. I plan to be a little bit lower, and the reason for that, we're seeing a trend down, of course. What you'll see when I present later is a lot of these specialty malts are coming out, and it's becoming more and more base malt, less dark crystal, less medium crystal. So the colors are coming down, which, it makes sense based on what we're seeing in the market.
Yeah, so that makes sense to me. The beers are getting paler, but we still want some malt complexity, some colour to the beer, some sort of backbone to support the hops. So I think I'll shoot for about that 6.5 SRM as well, because it's getting away from the more traditional Sierra Nevada, darker style pale ale, but is still retaining a bit of colour.
Flavor hops, we had 24 different flavor hops, most prominent Cascade and Centennial. Almost 50% of the recipes use those.
I'm surprised to see Cascade so high, but then again, when we're talking about competitions and winning beers, and the gold standard is Sierra Nevada, which uses primarily Cascade, maybe not all that surprising. But again, we're seeing still those big heavy hitters, Amarillo, Citra, Centennial, Cascade.
Aroma hops, again, Cascade, Citra, Centennial, Mosaic, Amarillo, and Simcoe. 3/4 of the recipes used some form of those hops.
Yeah, so more Cascade again as we get to Aroma, Citra, Mosaic, Amarillo, those New World hops coming through.
Dry hops, we had 28 different dry hops: Citra, Mosaic, Cascade, Simcoe, Amarillo, Centennial.
Yeah, so now Citra's starting to favour more heavily in the dry hops, and people want to get the most out of their dry hops, so why wouldn't they?
The rate of hop additions, we'll just go through it. Flavor hops, 70% of the recipes used a flavor hop at an average of 0.22 ounce per gallon or 1.65 grams per liter. You see the range here, pretty substantial range. Aroma hops, where 91% of the recipes use aroma or a whirlpool hop addition at 0.42 ounce per gallon or 3.15 grams per liter. Huge range between 0.1 and 1.6. Dry hops, about 80% of the recipes use a dry hop at 0.48 ounces per gallon or 3.59 grams per liter, a little bit higher than the Whirlpool edition. I plan to be on the high.
So let's do that. Let's make sure that our dry hop is 3.5 to 4 grams per litre, so we're getting enough dry hop punch in the final beer.
The yeast used, Chico, was the most prominent. Again, this is Chico defined this style of beer.
Yeah, we're going to use Chico too. I've got a particular yeast in mind, which I'll show you later on. So this information is from Lallemand, and first let's talk about biotransformation, because these are the things I'm looking for my American Pale Ale yeast to achieve for me. I want it to attenuate well. I want it to finish fairly dry. Not as dry as a lager, but still a dry sort of finish to the beer. I want a fairly neutral profile in terms of yeast character. I don't want any banana or fruity esters to be created by the yeast. I want it to get in and do its job without leaving behind all these yeast associated aromas and flavors. And the third thing I want to think about is biotransformation, which is why I've got this article from Lallemand. It talks about the use of glucosidase and beta lyase. These are two enzymes that are released by yeast during their fermentation. And what these are going to do, they're going to pump up the hop presence in our finished beer. I think for an American Pale Ale, the glucosidase is very important, because what that does is it will release things like linalool, these hop oils, into the beer that would otherwise be locked inside the hop and remain in there. So think of these enzymes like a little pair of scissors that are going to cut the oils off and release them into the beer so that you get more hop flavor and aroma from your hops into the finished beer. Beta lyase is more about releasing thiols. So these are really tropical fruit aromas. So I think that's also important, certainly in a modern IPA, but I think we'll want a little bit of that in our American Pale Ale too, at least the modern American Pale Ale. You've got to remember that even the original style, the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, that was dominant in Cascade, which is characterized by grapefruit finish, especially in late editions. So we want those tropical sort of grapefruit aromas to make it into our finished beer also. So let's have a look at the Lallemand yeasts and how they perform with secreting these enzymes. The blue is the beta lyase, which produces more and releases bound thiols, and the glucosidase, which releases other hop oil compounds. And the one I've chosen, BRY97, is really high in beta glucosidase and fairly high in beta lyase when compared to all the other yeast strains. If you chose Verdant IPA, that would release more of those tropical thiol flavors and aromas. But we're going to go with this BRY97, which gives us a good balance between these two enzymes. So we're hoping that by selecting this yeast, we're going to get the most out of our hop flavor and aroma. So now we've got all that information, we can start to compile our own recipe and start to design something so that we can make an American Pale Ale that's going to be a killer just the way we want. And you'll see up above here, I've got all the targets I want to hit. I want an original gravity of 1055, I want an IBU of 35, SRM of 6.5, mash of 67 degrees Celsius, and boil of 60 minutes. Now what I have on hand, which I think is going to be perfect for this style, is the Superblend from Hoppy Days. I've got 5 kilos of that, and I've broken that down already into its constituents. The Hoppy Days Superblend is designed for pale ales, XPAs, blonde ales, double IPAs. It's meant to be a base that will maximize hops and also things like head retention. And it's made of 85% Compass Pale Malt, which is an American pale ale style pale malt. It's going to have a bit of character to it, but it's not going to be as big and bold as as a more English style ale malt. It's got a little bit of Vienna, 12%. Remember in Hendo's movie, he added a little bit of Vienna for colour. And also in the Mean Brews video, we saw the same thing. These winning pale ale recipes will use a little bit of Munich or Vienna to add a few melanoidins, bump the colour up and add a little bit more complexity to the malt. It's also got 3% chip malt, which helps with mouthfeel and head retention. So that's what I'm starting with, but as we can see, let's have a look at where we're at. We're hoping to hit about 5.1%, so our ABV is getting in the ballpark of where we might want to be, but our original gravity is still a little bit low. Remember, 1055 we want to hit, and our SRM is low too. We want to hit 6.5 and we're sitting at 5.6. So let's add a little bit of darker malt into this equation. So I've got some SM40 on hand. How much am I going to put in? Let's start with 100 grams. That's bumped us up to 1050 and a SRM of 5.9, which is still quite low. Okay, let's go a little bit higher. So SM40, I might as well explain while we're here. A dark style Munich malt designed as a single malt for dark ambers. So it's Munich malt on steroids. It's going to add more toast, bread crust, and some pretzel to the finished beer. So a little bit more malt complexity. But in the amounts we're using it, hopefully it's just a little background note. That brings us up to 6.1. How brave do we want to be? What if we take it up to 200 grams? What does that look like? 6.3, which is a bit below the average of the 6.5. I think that I'm going to run with that. I think I'm pretty happy with that. An SRM of 6.3, which was just a tad below the average winning percentage. 5.3 puts us right in the middle of the American Pale Ale band, and an original gravity of 1051's not too far off from the average winning OG of 1055. Alright, so let's think about what hops we have. What hops do I have on hand? Let's have a look. So I have Amarillo, which is like Cascade. I've only got a little bit of that on hand, so I'm going to use that 20 grams. I've got some Citra, which was also an interesting hop to use. Eldorado, maybe not, maybe a bit adventurous. And experimental hops. I think we're going to build this recipe mainly with Citra and Amarillo. So let's go back to our pale ale recipe. Let's start off with some Citra. Why am I using Citra in the early editions? Let's put in 20 grams and see where that leaves us. Okay. So this is a chart released by Yakima Chief Hops to tell you how much of the hops you put in a brew actually survive into the finished brew. And of course, different things will affect this. So hops used earlier in the brew are going to burn off a lot more volatiles, which means you'll have less flavor and aroma compounds in the finished beer. So if you have a look at this graph, Centennial has a very high survivables rate, which means a lot of those compounds from Centennial hops will hang around. Whereas if you look at Azacca or Cascade, if you use them early in the boil, you're going to boil off a lot of those compounds. These are the compounds that are measured in this graph We won't get into what each one of them does, but maybe just notice here, Citra and Mosaic are fairly high in survivables, which means if you put Citra early on in the boil, a lot more of that is going to survive into the finished beer than if you used Cascade or Azaka early in the boil. So with that in mind, we go back to our recipe. We're going to put in 20 grams of Citra, knowing that some of that will survive the boil process. Okay, let's add a 10-minute addition of Amarillo, that 20 grams I've got lying around, 10 minutes, which shouldn't bump. So that bumps us up to 28. So we might be able to put another addition in there. Let's think about what other hops we might want to add to this brew. So we're going to use another tool called Hop Maverick. So to think about what flavors we want in our beer, what's going to finish, we can use this tool called Hop Maverick, which I think is pretty cool, quite helpful. Let me show you what we want to do. Hops to compare, no, but I think we want... Alright, let's put in some Citra. Let's put in some Amarillo, which, you know, is going to be a bit like Cascade. And so that's going to give us heavy citrus, a little bit of tropical stone fruit, floral. What other hops did I have on hand? Let's have a look at the inventory. I've got HB 1019. I don't know if that'll be in here. 101, no. Let's try El Dorado and see what flavors that'll add to our mix. So it's giving us a little bit more herbal. Maybe that's not what we want. What other things do we have in here? Vic's Secret, that's high in alpha acids, 20%, but maybe we could sneak it in a dry hop. Let's see. Vic's Secret. Yeah, it's still playing within that ballpark, but not as bold. Interesting. Okay. Vic's Secret is going to be tropical fruit, pineapple, pine, passion fruit, herbal, and earthy. Look, that's going to be pretty good in a pint. Maybe we'll add some Vic's Secret to this pale ale as well. So I'll add it late because the alpha acid content in these hops is off the charts. Let's 10-minute boil, 20 minutes. Yeah, that's that's way too much. Okay, we'll put some I think what we'll do is just add another dose of Citra in the dry hop. Let's go 50 grams in there. And we still need, I think 50 grams is going to be 2.17 grams per litre. We can go higher than that. I think we can go up to 4 grams per litre would be a good set. So let's see, maybe we'll add some of that Vic's Secret in the dry hop. And we've still can bump our IBUs up a little bit more. So maybe we'll add some El Dorado. No, we won't add El Dorado. Maybe we'll add some more Citra. Add the 10-minute addition. Let's try 20, see where that gets us. And that brings us up to 37, which is okay. I'm going to go with that. So I'm going to settle for that. I'm going to settle for 20 grams of Citra at the 60-minute, 10-minute edition Amarillo and Citra, 20 minutes each, and then a dry hop of 100 grams, half Citra, half Vic Secret, and that will give us a dry hop ratio of 4.35 grams per litre in the fermenter. At this rate, we're not up at IPA levels, but we're up around pale ale levels. So I think that's about where we're going to land for this. We've already talked about our yeast, BRY97, which will hopefully get the best out of these hops for us. And we've talked about the 67 degrees Celsius. That's going to be, we're going to do a 60-minute, not a 45. End up about 5.3%, pretty happy with that. OG of 10051's pretty close to the 10055. You never know, if we get good efficiency, we might end up there anyway. 10.011 is within that band, a little bit drier than 10.015, but certainly good. SRM of 6.3, a little bit of colour, but definitely not too much. And IBUs of 37. All right, let's brew some beer. Now, unfortunately, all of this planning still couldn't ensure a smooth brew day. The mash is quite gluggy here, so I'm going to add some rice hulls to get ahead of the game this time. Again, maybe I milled my grain a little too fine, so that's my element after the brew. I don't think I'm going to get away with this. I think if you want to see my brew day from hell, check out this video.